Hello, welcome to High Tides, a series of presentations and a roundtable discussion on the many changing currents in music higher education. We have an exciting set of presentations for you from leading figures in the field. Laudan Nooshin is Professor of Music at City and a specialist in Iranian music and culture. And she describes the many challenges of doing EDI work in music higher ed, so that's work in equality, diversity and inclusion. Dr. Phillips is Senior Lecturer in Music at the Royal Northern College and is Chair of MusicHE. And she speaks to the wide range of advocacy and support work that MusicHE are doing at the moment, during COVID and before COVID, and also speaks to some future plans. Deborah Mawer is Research Professor of Music and Associate Director of Research at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, and focuses here on the RMA's work in building a music education pathway and a set of musicological resources for pre-tertiary students. Finally, Dr. Hilary McQueen is a lecturer in education at UCL Institute of Education, and she discusses her role leading the SMA's research into music literacy. So in addition to these four presentations, which are all really engaging and worth checking out, we've also got a roundtable discussion chaired by myself, where we develop themes from the presentations, and we look especially at questions around exclusion and inclusion, bottom-up approaches to enhancing the sector, and just more generally at some of the challenges and opportunities we all think music faces in 2020. So enjoy.
Hi everyone, I'm Laudan Nooshin and I'm here as RMA Lead on Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Issues and as co-chair of the recently formed EDI in Music Studies Network. I'd like to thank Lauren and Stephen for inviting me to contribute a position statement to this roundtable and for the opportunity both to talk about the recent initiative and to offer some thoughts on the challenges facing music higher education in this area. So let's not beat about the bush. MusicHE has a poor track record when it comes to inclusion and diversity. We know many of the reasons why, and why music has a particular problem. But as a subject area, we've been relatively slow to acknowledge, let alone start to address this. This is no longer a sustainable position. I often start discussions on this topic by referencing cultural theorist Sara Ahmed's work on diversity and racism in institutional life. In particular, her notion of space invaders and the politics of stranger making, how some become understood as the rightful occupants of certain spaces, while others are treated as invading the space reserved for others. I believe we need to ask ourselves what kind of music studies we want for the future and how we foster an inclusive and diverse field in which everyone feels a sense of ownership and belonging. How do we create educational and research environments that don't feel like spaces reserved for others? I first joined RMA Council as an ordinary member in 2015 and served for 3 years, during which time the question of diversity was discussed periodically, mainly in response to questions from members about the lack of certain kinds of diversity among the RMA leadership, rather than being raised by Council itself as a cause for concern. Those brief discussions generally concluded that diversity in MusicHE was an issue beyond the remit and control of the RMA, and that until the field itself became more diverse, Council would continue to reflect that. End of discussion. When I rejoined Council in January 2019, things had moved on considerably, and I was pleasantly surprised to find an already active discussion that recognised this as an urgent issue that could no longer be brushed aside. And the RMA was already liaising with NAMHE about setting up an EDI working group to explore possible actions. Following my election as Vice President last September, I took on the lead from the RMA end and have worked with Helen Miners in setting up what is now the cross-organisational EDI-MS network with both academic and industry-affiliated organisations. The network aims to promote, support and share good practice in order to address historical underrepresentation across a range of areas, including but not limited to ethnicity, class, disability, gender, neurodivergence, sexuality and so on. This includes listening to voices that have historically been excluded. The network comprises a series of working groups and a steering group with representatives from each of the affiliated academic organisations. So I'm not going to say much more about the network right now, but you can read about it here. Here's the website. EDIMS is relatively new, but there are already around 80 people actively involved, and we hope that the network will provide impetus and a subject-specific space for discussion, reflection, and action as a way of moving towards longer-term structural change. We recognise that this is ongoing work that needs to be sustainable and that it is not confined to one group, but operates alongside national initiatives such as Athena Swan and the Race Equality Charter. The EDIMS network is one of several current initiatives across MusicHE, some of which were presented at the event at City University in January of this year, as well as in the wider music industry, including the Key Change and PRS's 50-50 Gender Equality Pledge, the establishment of the Chineke Foundation in 2015, Sound and Music's recent pledge to interview all BAME applicants, and so on. Of course, many of us have been flagging up issues of diversity and equality for many years, so it's wonderful to see them become normalised rather than regarded as an aberration. While such initiatives are clearly important, there are a number of issues and challenges which I will now move on to explore. One perennial question is whether soft EDI work, effectively remedial actions that compensate for the deficiencies of the system and that address symptoms rather than root causes, whether this can operate alongside more substantive structural change. Philip Ewell has critiqued EDI, quote, solutionism, arguing that in the rush to find solutions, we perhaps avoid interrogating the conditions that create the inequalities in the first place. He suggests that EDI work may even hinder structural change because it may seem as though we're dealing with root issues when we're not. He cites the case of the Society for Music Theory that has been trying to increase diversity in its membership since the 1990s without much success, using some of the same positive actions that we are only just starting to see in the UK. Another issue relates to the language of diversity and inclusivity, which is not unproblematic. Sarah Ahmed explores how these concepts are used in neoliberal managerial contexts where they can be, quote, a sign of the lack of commitment to change and might even allow organisations such as universities to conceal the operation of systematic inequalities. Further, and perhaps paradoxically, one of the dangers of diversity discourse is that it risks reducing people to a single identity. In order to understand the workings of privilege and exclusion, we need to consider the intersection of identities and the ways in which, again to quote from Ahmed, how we experience one category depends on how we inhabit others. Indeed, one of our challenges in the EDIMS network is how we address different kinds of underrepresentation without privileging one over others. Going back to the debate around incremental versus structural change, it would be churlish to suggest that the former has not made a difference. Change has been slow, and at times painful, but it has happened. Reflecting on what the field looked like when I was an undergraduate student in a not untypical music department in the early 1980s, with an all-white and all-male faculty and a curriculum largely focused on a pantheon of dead white German composers, that department has changed beyond recognition. I sometimes need to remind myself that one of the reasons I was drawn to ethnomusicology was that the predominantly white and male field of musicology in the 1980s did not feel like somewhere I belonged. Gender representation is an area where there has been progressive incremental change, and the fruits of this long-term work can now be seen, for instance, in the number of women in leadership positions. It's not that women weren't entering music studies, but until quite recently there were relatively few in leadership roles such as heads of department. This is changing thanks also to initiatives such as Athena Swan and the Aurora programme that have given women more confidence in envisaging themselves in such roles. The RMA is about to welcome its first female president in January 2021, with a vice presidential team currently comprised entirely of women, a historical first. In other words, the issue is not just about representation per se, but who gets into positions of leadership and decision-making. Of course, these changes have yet to make much of a dent when it comes to gender representation in the curriculum, and women continue to be poorly represented in areas such as music technology and popular music studies, the exact same areas that have experienced the most growth in the sector in recent years. Whilst incremental change may in some ways be more resilient over time, it's at moments of crisis when structural deficiencies and imbalances of power become most stark. It's not coincidental that those in MusicHE most affected by COVID-related cost-cutting are the precariously employed and staff on short-term contracts, amongst whom already underrepresented groups are overly impacted. Only structural change can address this, but such change is slow and complex, not least because we're tied into wider power structures that extend well beyond the field. Clearly, there is a long way to go and many issues to work through. Will we ever reach a stage, for instance, where we interview anonymously for academic positions, an equivalent to orchestral blind auditions, which in the US resulted in a sharp increase in the number of women in professional orchestras? And what about those colleagues who don't recognise that there is a problem, or who suggest that it is in fact the former centre of the field that is now under threat, perhaps an academic equivalent to white fragility? There are many and complex reasons for these views, and no time to discuss here, but I have often wondered how many of such colleagues have themselves experienced marginality, personally or in scholarly terms. How many simply take being in the normative centre as a right without recognising their own privilege? How many have faced overt racism or even wondered whether someone's aggression is due to their being a woman or a person of colour or gay? Either way, there is a lot of myth-busting to be done, not least around notions of decolonisation, which is not about excising Western classical music from the curriculum, but about challenging and decentering the normative and therefore generally invisible operations of privilege, and to lay bare the power relations underlying all knowledge construction. Some of the recent discussions have asked how we might start thinking about the kinds of harm our research and teaching practices have done. And Lissa Reed talked eloquently about this at the recent Decolonising the Musical University event. When I see essentialised comments such as this tweet, this has generated a great deal of discussion in recent weeks. I wonder how responsible we are by way of certain stereotypes unwittingly, or wittingly even, legitimised through our work. Such lay comments are evidence that we do have a problem in our field because they reflect what people see in our music education system and the wider music industry. We're clearly at an important moment in the history of music studies and the RMA itself, which has been working hard to diversify its membership and leadership. But the RMA also needs to ask some hard questions of itself as an organisation about what it represents and whether it is part of the problem it seeks to address. At a time when statues are being pulled down for what they symbolically valorise of our violent imperial and colonial past, where does that leave an organisation that receives validation from an institution, the monarchy, that promoted and benefited from that same past? Just to be clear, I'm not advocating a name change for the RMA, although it would be interesting to know the views of the membership, and even more interesting perhaps to know how much of a barrier it is to new members. And of course, several UK music organisations have changed their names in recent years. But neither do I think we can fulfil our potential to represent the widest range of music studies whilst maintaining it. There is a choice to be made. None of this is easy, and at the very least, we need an open discussion. After all, we were the Musical Association from our founding in 1874 until 1944, almost as long as we've been royal. No doubt its royalness confers the RMA with authority and prestige, but perhaps there are more important priorities now. While we're about it, we might also want to reassess our logo. Many of the initiatives to redress historical underrepresentation predated but have gained added impetus through the most recent Black Lives Matter protests. And what is particularly noticeable is how the debates around racial discrimination and underrepresentation have become highly emotive and polarising, partly because they link to wider issues such as the legacy of colonialism and empire in ways that are less obvious for other kinds of underrepresentation. Understandably, there is anger and frustration, a natural response from those who've long felt marginalised and even silenced. Whether the debate is around responses to Philip Ewell's Music Theory Online article, calls for the SEM president to resign for a failure of leadership on issues of racism, students at Cambridge writing an open letter to the faculty calling for the decentering of Western classical music and the appointment of black professors, or the platforming of jingoistic lyrics, the levels of emotion are high. Social media allows everyone to have a voice and an opinion, but it is also in the nature of social media to encourage unnuanced and somewhat entrenched positions, as well as binary discourses such as white versus black. This is not a space conducive to working through the many difficult questions in a measured and constructive manner. And there are, of course, many difficult questions. How do we reclaim musics that may seem tainted by fraught and violent colonial histories without impoverishing the curriculum for future generations? What might a dismantled and restructured music studies look like? And what does it mean anyway for this work to take place within the very institutions, together with their structures of inequality, that were founded on colonial thinking and funded by the riches of empire, and where the decolonising may even be led by erstwhile colonisers? In the midst of the current debate, I get a sense that neither the discourses of diversity nor decolonising serve us particularly well. The former is arguably too semantically and emotively overburdened. By contrast, diversity can appear disconnected from power, but is in fact highly ideological. What we need is a concept that lies somewhere between the emotive weight of decolonisation and the rather woolly, politically blunt notion of diversity. Our aspiration for EDIMS is to provide a space for measured and constructive discussion, where different voices can be listened to and a more inclusive music studies can be envisioned. We need to find a way of acknowledging past injustices without creating new exclusions. For the moment, sticking plasters may be all we have, but it is very clear that these debates are not going away. The case for a more diverse MusicHE is not just about doing the right thing, but about fostering a richer field of study. What gives me hope is when I talk to younger scholars, the future of our field, most of whom are committed to change and who understand why there is no alternative. Thank you.
My name is Michelle Phillips. I'm Chair of MusicHE, and I'm going to be talking about what I see and what MusicHE sees as the recent, immediate and longer-term needs of our sector of music in higher education. It's hard to not focus on coronavirus, and so I'm going to just start by recapping some of the activity we have undertaken in that period, and then important activity we've undertaken before that and our plans for the future, and then I'll reflect on what I see as the needs of the sector. I took over as chair of MusicHE as acting chair in October 2019, and then I was elected as chair in January 2020, so it's quite a year to have taken on the role of the chair. So here's some of the activity that we've undertaken over the last 6 months. We've included in our mailing list all of our colleagues who wanted to be included in MusicHE, not just those who've traditionally been MusicHE members. And then we gave the members a fee holiday this year. I think that's been really important over the last 6 months, and it's a key part of what MusicHE can do, I think, in supporting the community and thereby the discipline. We started at the beginning of lockdown by creating and sharing Google Docs, mainly on Twitter and on email, with best practice in terms of lessons online and tips for how you can teach music online. One of the most fruitful things I think we've done over this period is our 4 Zoom video calls with all colleagues across the sector. We had over 100 on one of the calls, and generally the numbers were between about 40 and 80, which were themed, and we talked about issues that we're all tackling in our own institutions. We've also spent the last 6 months on our email lists sharing research relating to performance and other issues around the pandemic. And we are planning another call just before we all begin our terms to just talk about how we're all planning the term and the year ahead. We've also, of course, been part of the REF consultation that's happened over the last 6 months, and we've responded to that. We've worked quite closely with the RMA on that. I think that's been really important. And of course, we've been thinking a lot about the Black Lives Matter issues and how we can most usefully contribute to those very key problems that we have in our sector around diversity. We've done a lot on our website and social media. I think this has been a key time to make use of our Twitter feed, to reach people and to be able to share important developments and research and resources as they arrive. And we've also made sure that we have attended meetings where we can work with partners, but also learn something that we can share with our community. For example, we've attended a couple of meetings with Music Mark, which has been very useful. We've been quite conscious of staying in touch with members, so we've communicated regularly, lots of email contact, and we've also been able to share with members and with our wider mailing list during this time notices that we've had from the Arts and Humanities Alliance, from the British Academy, when they've had important things to share and for us to contribute to. I think one of the most important things we've done, activity that had started pre-2020, is our work on equality, diversity and inclusivity. So previously we were running a set of events with colleagues across the sector, and now, as I'm sure you've seen, there is this new EDIMS network, which is its own self-standing organisation, which MusicHE have been really proud to support and continue to support. One of the most public and hopefully most impactful things we've done over the last 6 months is that we worked with Ali Daubney and a couple of other organisations, ISM and teachers, and we wrote this short statement that we sent to the Times about the importance of music education in schools and how this should not fall off the agenda or fall off the curriculum post-pandemic. And that we were able to get over 400 signatures from colleagues across music in higher education over just a couple of days, and that was a weekend as well. So huge thanks to all of you for signing that. I think that's something really powerful that we were able to help with. And then finally, I think one of the most important things for me and for some people who I've spoken to over the last 6 months is that we've helped to bring our discipline together. We've helped to create a renewed sense of community. I've gotten to know a lot more people, a lot more colleagues, and I think that is something really solid and really important for us to continue. And I know lots of other people are keen on that as well. So these Zoom video calls have been really essential in that, I think, to work more closely together as a sector. Here are some of the things that we did before this. So we've only just really rebranded from NAMHE to MusicHE. That was in November 2019. We announced that at our annual conference, which was around preserving the health of our discipline. So it was around issues in recruitment, which took place at the RNCM. And then again, late last year, that's when we had a real drive to boost our committee. So we recruited 8 new committee members by election. And that has been absolutely wonderful and really important for us, that we have these fantastic people volunteering their time and energy, and it's been really key in how much we could achieve over the last 6 months. So huge thanks to the new committee. A few notable things that we had undertaken before the current academic year. We were invited to be involved in the Department for Education review of A-level and GCSE syllabi. That was a few years ago. So we were round the table with the exam boards discussing what those briefs, what should an A-level in music and a GCSE in music include. So that was really important, I think, to have a voice at that table. We have previously given support to music departments who've been under threat. We've written letters, we've spoken out about the importance of a music presence, a thriving music department in universities. And in the past, that has been very successful. And I think that's going to be quite key as we go into the post-pandemic world. We've had some very successful reports and pieces of research that we've commissioned, such as the Gender Equality Report, again, a few years ago, to look at gender issues in higher education. And we've previously compiled an external examiners database. Those are a few of the things that I think have been important in the past. One of the other things that we've done is we created 4 videos on the value of a music degree, which are on our website. And I think, again, these are really important in making it clear how useful a degree in music can be. And this is also something that is we're continuing into the next year. It's one of our key plans. Here are our plans so far for 2020-21. Of course, in addition to this, we'll be continuing to work with our community and share best practice around how we all teach in this socially distanced world. So we are intending to commission a graduate outcomes report. So this will be a piece of research which looks at what graduates go on to do when they have a degree in music, and how versatile that can be, how useful that can be, how employable graduates are. That we were planning to do that earlier this year, but that's been on hold because of the coronavirus activity that we've focused on. But that will be something we'll do next year. We've been talking about how we best work with other colleagues, for example, those in further education, so we can expand our networks and work with an even wider group of people. We've also been thinking hard about how we best contribute to the Black Lives Matter debate, and we're currently pulling together a list of resources to share amongst our community on how we can make our curriculum more diverse. How can we include music, examples, issues that better represent the world and better give a better sense of equality. I think this is so important, as we've all realised, and it's perhaps coming too late, so that's quite an urgent one. And finally, we're planning our annual conference. That will probably be around May. We'll probably bring that back to May, and we're still debating the date and the theme. So we'll let you know about that if you usually come along. So finally, to kind of bring all that together, what are the needs of our sector? So given all of the activity that we have undertaken recently and all the activity we have planned, this is how I see it. I think a key need for our sector is advocacy, is for individuals and for MusicHE to speak out about the value of music, the huge value of music in society, in the curriculum, in HE, around the world. And I think we are a key organisation to do that. So, for example, our work with music in schools and all the work we've done with you all in higher education has helped with that and will continue to help with that. Consultation, I think we are a key body to respond to consultations, such as work with the Department for Education and the REF. I think we need to continue to be a voice in those exercises. Networks, I think we need to continue to spread our wings, to work with our partners to achieve more, to become more aware of wider sector issues. So, for example, we need to continue our work with Music Mark, with ISM, with further education colleges, but also our other colleagues in higher education, so the RMA, the EDIMS network, the SMA, SEMPRE, all those other organisations. This sense of community, I think, is really important, and I think we are in a unique position to do this. We are a membership organisation who is regularly in contact with colleagues and departments and conservatoires in music and HE around the country, and I think we can play a really key role in bringing people together, sharing best practice, sharing ideas, debating issues. And then finally, and to me I'd say most importantly, we need to be a powerful voice. I think this is a key need of the sector now more than ever. We need to be an organisation that speaks out when we need to speak out and is heard and is respected. And I think we're already there. I think we can continue to do this. I think MusicHE as an organisation carries weight, and I think where issues arise, which they will, I'm sure, around music in higher education over the next year and longer term, we need to be an organisation that is quick to respond and makes very clear the importance and value of music in higher education. And here, just to finish, is a quote from one of our colleagues who's been attending the Zoom calls over the last 6 months. He said that MusicHE is really leading the way in their response to the current and ongoing situation, which I think is a really lovely thing to say. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to lead the way and be a powerful voice in a world where there are lots of issues, and these are possibly going to increase, that might threaten music in higher education, when we know the value means that we can't allow that to happen. Music in higher education is such a powerful and important thing. Okay, great. That's everything from me. Thank you.
I am Hilary McQueen, a lecturer in education at UCL Institute of Education with a background in music, psychology and education. This presentation offers an overview of the music literacy project which I was commissioned to undertake by the trustees of the Society for Music Analysis and includes some preliminary findings. The research is not complete, so any conclusions at this stage are tentative. I would be grateful if you did not refer to the research other than to mention its existence until the final report has been produced in December 2020. I began the project in January 2019, supported most helpfully by Esther Cabot, one of the SMA's trustees. Here you can see the original brief for the research. The agreement was for a total of 96 days of work over 2 years. The research aimed to find out if there was a gap in music literacy for those applying for music degrees, and to define a potential role for the SMA in helping to bridge or fill any gaps. Other questions arise from this. For instance, if there is a gap, at what point does it start or widen? Is there a problem with the value of music education that has led to its decline in some areas? What is music literacy? Who is responsible for developing music literacy, however that might be defined, given that not everyone can have private music lessons? What music literacy is taught and how? What resources exist, and are there any further resources that would be helpful? A preliminary stage sought the views of some of the trustees of the SMA to fine-tune my original brief. Following that, there were 2 stages to the project: interviews and an anonymous survey. In addition to the original brief, a study day was added thanks to funding from the Institute of Musical Research. This took place on the 15th of July 2020. I spent considerable time contacting organisations with an interest in music education, schools, music hubs, university departments, and so on, requesting participation. I sent emails to named individuals where possible, rather than a general contact email on a website. This applied to music hubs, university and secondary schools. I do wonder the extent to which information was passed on. For instance, I know that one music lead at a music hub did not receive the information from the admin team. Only one school exam board responded to an invitation for an interview, and that was to refuse. There was very limited response from music exam boards, including after speaking directly to representatives at Music Expo 2020. I conducted 24 interviews through convenience and snowball sampling. The surveys for music students and music teachers or lecturers closed on the 1st of July 2020. As hoped, a range of views is represented by the sample. The data have been downloaded, but at this point have not been analysed fully. Some highlights are presented today to give a sense of what participants have said. Here are some of the survey questions. I will comment on these in the partial analysis which follows in this paper. One question was about the purpose of music education. Although the views of music teachers and music students are quite similar, the emphases are slightly different. Music students rated learning slightly higher than enjoyment. Perhaps music teachers underestimate the value placed on learning by students. Another question was about whether music education in the participants' experience was inclusive of people from different backgrounds or who have diverse music preferences. What is evident here is that the findings are similar to the National Student Survey in terms of inclusion. Institutions generally are not that inclusive. The ranges demonstrate how very varied this perception is, however. The survey was anonymous, including the institutions concerned, but further analysis might give some insight into why the range is as great as it is. Music literacy is not easy to define. Since this question underpinned the research, the responses need to be looked at in more detail. Some interviewees clearly thought I was looking for a specific answer, such as literacy means reading and writing music, whereas my approach was deliberately non-partisan. My literature review includes a definition derived from multiliteracies in language. The fundamental question of what language or languages underpin music literacy will be addressed in the report and was one of the questions posed at the Music Literacy Study Day. Perhaps it is not surprising that instrumental teachers contribute greatly to the development of music literacy as the participants have defined it. The fact that independent study was chosen by so many indicates that there is an important role for suggesting or developing excellent resources. Secondary school teachers were also helpful. Other options were chosen much less often, for example, family and primary school teachers. Although the individual items can't be seen here very clearly, a number of different expectations were offered. These were level 3 qualification, for example A-level, grades 6 to 8 on an instrument, grade 5 or above in theory, use of technology to create music, able to read at least one clef, able to write music at least at a basic level, knowledge of music history, knowledge of Western classical composers, knowledge of different genres, different forms, the ability to sing, ability to write essays about music, to analyse music, even if basically, and people were allowed to make their own choices. 66% of teachers said their expectations for students were met. Overall, teachers and students had similar expectations. I have highlighted 2 points of difference between teachers and students. Teachers selected music tech skills more often than students, and the ability to sing. In terms of whether extra resources would be helpful, generally respondents considered that they would be. Suggestions for what type of resources are shown here. It was interesting to see the preferences for workbooks by quite a few of the students. Interviews are still under analysis, but some possible themes are offered here. One is the idea of a continuum for curriculum and separately for pedagogy. The plan is to plot the participants onto this diagram to indicate the extent to which they see the curriculum and pedagogy as appropriate or effective. Other themes include the extent to which someone's own musical experience is valued or otherwise. The importance of relevance in music pedagogy, therefore a curriculum issue because it does not fit students' interests in some cases. A concern about primary education and lack of training for teaching music, as well as the lack of music specialists. Concerns about social justice, and whether the curriculum imposes an irrelevant or colonial curriculum, or in fact aims to broaden horizons. And concern for the future of music education as knowledge and skills change or are depleted. Finally, I offer some tentative conclusions based on the literature review and the project in general. The first is a consideration of the idea of music literacies and what that would mean for music education. The second is the value of notation, which, like written language, still has an important role. A quote from the Laudan report from 1967 is one that some may or may not agree with. The importance of music literacy is not fully understood. Without it, independent effort, progression and discovery are impossible, and unfamiliarity with musical notation breeds the kind of suspicion that verbal illiteracy usually brings in its train. However, there are some excellent examples of work in schools, both primary and secondary. But there are still some concerns that are similar to those expressed by the Laudan report, and the idea that music education provision is rather patchy in England. Music exemplifies some schools' ethos, with pictures of ensembles and bands on their website's homepage. To that extent, it remains a very important part of many schools' activities. There is a plethora of research indicating the benefits of learning music. The last 2 points directly address the research title, Questioning the Gap in Music Literacy and Defining a Role for the SMA. The general view appears to be that there is a gap, but there are many possible outcomes from accepting that. To some extent, these are already underway. For example, a foundation year, widening access to those without traditional qualifications. Some solutions might be filling the gap in some way, strengthening music education for all, perhaps through music hubs or providing additional resources, or broadening music analysis to embrace technological advances. Although the EBAC has affected a small number of institutions, the evidence does not suggest that it has had a major influence in the majority of schools. The quality of education provided by schools is very influential. Private education, either school or instrumental, is very important in maintaining music education in universities. What role might the SMA have? The interest in high-quality resources suggests that is one possibility. However, music education has changed, so consideration of how multiliteracies can be incorporated to enhance it rather than to water it down will be very important.
Hello, I'm Deborah Mawer, Research Professor at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. My main research focuses on the history and analysis of 20th century French music, where I've just finished leading an AHRC project called Accenting the Classics. But I'm also a National Teaching Fellow and have been active on the editorial board of the British Journal of Music Education since 2007. As a member of council of the Royal Musical Association, the RMA, and the association's lead on music education, I'd like to present this short position statement. I'll now switch over to voiceover mode and share a few PowerPoint slides with you. As part of the RMA's important strategic aim to promote equality, diversity and inclusion, we've been expanding the association's work in its support of pre-tertiary music education through a music education initiative to foster better connections between music in schools and HE. And we've recently established a web presence for this. A partial catalyst for our initiative was found in the inspirational example of our sister scholarly association, the Royal Historical Society. On the one hand, this move is testimony to the association's deep concern over the future of music education. On the other hand, more positively, it acknowledges the importance of new blood to secure dynamic future growth and knowledge, so seeking to broaden our research and scholarship remit. Amongst its wide-ranging membership of some 1,100 or so musicians, the RMA already has a significant number, well over 10%, who are active as music teachers, encompassing subdisciplines of musicology, composition, performance, technology, and so on. And it's keen to develop this strand of activity further. Across summer 2019, I undertook research on behalf of the RMA to establish from amongst its music teaching membership the areas where greatest educational need and best RMA fit were perceived, and what the realistic priorities for activities on a small budget should be. The results of this research were analysed, anonymised and tabulated, as you can see. The views of the RMA Council were also elicited. A particular priority emerged in enhancing the musicological provision for sixth form students and staff, including supporting research skills in the broadest sense. And this therefore has become our current focus and priority. As detailed on this next slide, a music education working group has subsequently been set up that includes RMA members from both the university and conservatoire sectors and from secondary schools, independent and state, as well as representation from the Society for Music Analysis, the SMA, and MusicHE, formerly NAMHE. Working group business is conducted mainly by email. One of the first tasks of the working group was to construct a strongly worded statement submitted in March 2020 to the Department for Education, the DFE, as part of the public consultation on shaping the updated National Plan for Music Education. And you can see the alarming headline given here on the slide. This statement, signed off by the RMA President, warns against an imminent deep crisis facing music education, especially in state schools. Our perception, sadly, is reinforced elsewhere, for instance in an article of April 2020 by Alison Dobney, Gary Spruce and others, The Declining Place of Music Education. Symptoms include secondary school music suites being turned into physics labs because music doesn't feature as a core subject, the EBAC problem. The acute decline in GCSE music, let alone A-level, and fear of earlier erosion at key stages 1 to 3, up to age 14. Plus, at the other end of the spectrum, the definite withdrawal after 2023 to 24 of the Cambridge Pre-U qualification for the brightest students. And we argue that, in due course, direct implications will be felt by the RMA itself, together with the SMA, MusicHE and others. Unfortunately, it has to be said that this sense of crisis has only been reinforced, intensified, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the now inevitable recession and consequent further cost-cutting. So the need to secure a music education pathway from pupil to student to professional has never been greater. And while these challenges may seem almost insurmountable, overwhelming, the best way forward has to be for us to work together, to pool our efforts, as in this conference session, also working with the Music Teachers Association, the ISM, various music hubs and so on. On a happier note, the RMA was represented at a national music education debate held at City, University of London, in autumn 2019. This debate on the challenges, but also the opportunities for music in the curriculum, was chaired by Stephen Berryman of the MTA, working with a wide-ranging panel of experts and very well supported by a large audience of music teachers and students. Following the great success of this event, we intend to set up an RMA-badged sequel on a related theme. However, due to current circumstances, these plans have been set back until at least autumn 2020, since ideally we also want to have spontaneous live debate. Our most recent activity, currently in progress, is the development and curatorship of a collection of musicology readings, using the most inclusive interpretation of the term musicology, for music teachers and sixth formers. These featured readings will include short introductions with suggestions for onward reading, study and development of research skills. Further materials will be added to our newly established RMA webpage just as soon as they become available. So please watch this space, and if you want to become actively involved, just get in touch and do so. Thank you very much for listening.
So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. You all spoke really eloquently across a wide range of issues, but whether it's Hilary talking about tensions around the skills gap in music literacy, Laudan and Michelle talking about the sort of challenges of doing EDI and other work in higher education music, or Deborah and the RMA's efforts to build a music education pathway. I found a theme of sort of inclusion/exclusion running powerfully through all of the presentations. So of people feeling excluded, of subject areas being excluded, or of people or subjects excluding themselves in one way or another. So in order just to get the conversation going and poke at this a little bit, I wonder, could we start at maybe a bit of a curious place and ask a sort of a large opening question? So not necessarily starting with the concrete details of what you've all discussed, although obviously we'll get to those, but think about, to begin, a problem that we've all probably grappled with as we're doing work in MusicHE. And Laudan actually describes this problem really well in her presentation in terms of soft or remedial work. So this is the idea that all of us are maybe in danger of applying, as Laudan puts it, sticking plasters to a discipline that exists both with and within a complex history, social history, in which many of the things we're trying to unpick are so deeply sort of entrenched and embedded that they may almost be impossible to overcome from within this very local context. So, in other words, we might have really good intentions and we might work really well to expand and to evolve the discipline, but without sort of more deeply rooted social change, we may be working within a sort of profoundly incomplete theory or paradigm of change. So before we get to the details of your papers, I wonder, could you just, each of you in turn, speak a little bit on this issue, this idea that we might be limited in what we can do from within music to music. So if we could start with Laudan, and then we'll go round, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, I mean, this is one of our big challenges, I think. I don't think there are any easy answers. I think that there probably are limits to what we can do just working within music. You know, within our own institutions, we obviously have to work within those structures as well. And as you say, some of the inequalities and inequities in our discipline are very, very deep rooted. So a quick answer, I guess, to your question is yes, I think we are limited. I think what gives me a lot of hope at the moment is that we're talking about these things at least in a way that we weren't probably even 2 or 3 years ago. It's not something that we can brush aside, as I said in my presentation, any longer. And you know, I feel like with the EDIMS network, I feel quite conflicted because on the one hand, I really recognise the limits of what we can do. But I think whatever we do will be better than nothing, I think. You know, I take on board the criticisms of those who might say, well, actually, without wider structural change, none of this is going to change anything. I think we've seen in various areas, and I give the case of gender representation, that things have changed, actually. When I compare my undergraduate, what music as a discipline in this country was, it has changed, but obviously there are still huge inequalities. So those are my broad thoughts.
Thank you. I wonder, Deborah, could you expand on that? I know that in your presentation you talked about learning lessons from the Royal Historical Association for the RMA's work. So I wonder, could you think about that question in that context, maybe?
Thanks, yes, Royal Historical Society.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly complex question of inclusion, exclusion, and privilege, lack of privilege, and there are, as Laudan says, inescapable inequalities. In terms of the diversity, of race, of gender, but also of class, of a north-south divide, which I'm acutely aware of up here in Lancaster, of affluence and poverty. So there are many. There's a real sort of complex network here. And so in terms of the skills and experiences that our students then have, yes, there's a huge spectrum. In a sense, it's the ultimate comprehensive teaching. But I suppose, I would like to keep a very positive slant on this, because whilst there are structures, and we're limited institutionally in terms of what exactly we can do, there are pedagogical tools that we can use to get the best out of students from a very broad variety of backgrounds, by sometimes putting the ball in their court and working to their experience. And not all those experiences have to be identical. I think variety is a very attractive feature of curricula, both, hopefully as far as we can get it within secondary education, but also in tertiary. So I think, beyond the sort of notion of QAA benchmarks and so on, I would argue that difference is good, and we should celebrate it, and we shouldn't all try and do the same thing. And we should seek to have specialists in particular areas and enjoy the heterogeneity of what is music and musicology in the broader sense.
Thank you. I'm liking these notes of hope and positivity. Very encouraging. Michelle, do you want to come in on that opening question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question and absolutely pertinent, really important, and we need to do more. I agree with everything Laudan and Deborah said. And I think, it's quite nice to see that, yes, there are probably huge problems with diversity in all sorts of ways. But if you look at our panel today, we're more diverse than a panel might have been 40 years ago. So maybe, there is progress being made, and let's hope that can continue. I think diversity is always a good thing. It enriches us as human beings, doesn't it, as scholars? And I think we're all aware that it's a good thing the more humans can work together. It's interesting, I think, this issue of diversity, which is so important and needs a huge investment of all of our time, because music is diverse. So music as a phenomenon in the world is diverse. Every culture in the world has music. When you turn on MTV or when you look at what's available out there in the world in terms of performance, music is diverse. I think perhaps the study of music hasn't quite caught up. The study of music perhaps is not so diverse. And I think part of why that's been tricky, especially given that it's clear that a lot of us feel very passionately about this, is because we're under lots of other pressures in other ways, which I think came across in our presentations. We're all working hard in lots of areas, and we really want to put the time into diversity. So I think these issues are extremely important. So I think raising awareness is great, and I think Laudan's network with colleagues is absolutely fantastic. I think this is an agenda we all need to buy into, and hopefully we can make progress, although we are going to be slightly limited, not least because of resources and things in the light of the pandemic. But yeah, really important question.
Thank you. And Hilary, finally, on that opening question.
Yes, so I'm drawing on the findings from the research so far, which has actually gone further than when I was able to do the presentation. So we've had a study day and I've done some more analysis. So one of the things that's strongly coming out is about social justice and the different ways that people view that, what it means to be socially just. So that's a big area actually that I need to explore. And related to that is what is taught and how it's taught, and they're slightly different things with some overlap. And therefore, some people would argue that there is a limit of what people could do within, because they're constrained in secondary, particularly thinking about what exams there are, by the curriculum that sort of channels people in a particular direction. But there is this idea of change, which a lot of people are talking about in terms of diversifying the musics, as people are saying. So in that sense, they feel that they're including a lot more people with different kinds of music, not just Western art music, and that is a curriculum thing. But does that really address a lot of the issues that we've been mentioning just now? One of the big things that's coming through is about primary education, actually, and unfortunately, in some places, it's not as good as it could be. In other places, fantastic. So in terms of sort of diversity, you've got a kind of regional issue as well going on. And then the other thing was about, partly to do with higher education, is the top-down, bottom-up thing. So I mentioned this, I think, in the presentation, but it's coming through that some people are seeing some really good ways that from sort of bottom-up direction, whether with that schools or organisations or higher education, there is a lot that can be done. But then equally, from the top-down perspective, people are saying there are problems with GCSE, A-level, and so on, and those things need to be addressed too in order to kind of get a complete picture of it. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And if I can just briefly come in, I think that idea of bottom up, so focusing on primary and secondary as well as tertiary, runs through at least two of the four presentations, possibly three. So I wonder, could we just unpick that a little bit and have a think about it? So Hilary, you spoke about multiple literacies in your presentation. So I wonder, what might that look like at a primary and secondary level, and how might it feed into an expanded curriculum and pedagogical approach at higher education for us as musicologists and music teachers? So does anyone have any thoughts on that idea of multiple literacies and how it connects all these different levels of education in music?
I had the same question for Hilary, actually. I was interested in this notion of multiliteracies.
Yes.
And actually, more generally, I had a question about because the question of how one defines musical literacy was obviously a theme through your presentation, and I wondered what the sort of sense you were getting about this was. That I got a sense initially that there was a sort of underlying assumption that it was kind of, being able to read staff notation, but then you did talk about musical literacy in a broader sense, about understanding music. So I would be really interested to hear more about that.
Okay, just to say that I didn't come into the research with any, I'm sure I have my own ideas, it's inevitable, but the research was very, very open and asking people to define music literacy for themselves. It's not for me to come in and say what it is. Having done some further analysis, many of the staff, and this from a very wide range of institutions, higher education, secondary education, private teachers, reading and writing music did come up very strongly. The thing about multiliteracies is that it's come from teaching of languages, and it's the acknowledgement of the idea that people use, in this case, it would be music literacy in different ways. So in English, for example, it could be writing a text message, or using online instructions and all those. So there are all these different kinds of literacy, and it can apply to music as well. And the point about it is not to say that we shouldn't be working towards something. So people are not saying, oh, that's okay, you can all use multiliteracies. We no longer need to have a more standard literacy that everyone can share. It's not saying that. It's acknowledging the importance of those different literacies and how one can then incorporate those into a broader scheme that kind of has some sort of endpoint of, if you're going to study music, it's really useful to be able to do these things, but we're not saying that other things aren't important as well. It's a big area, there are a lot of books on it, and you'll need to read the final report to get the fine detail of it, but hopefully that gives a flavour of the idea of multiliteracies.
That's really interesting. Can I just come in with a kind of follow-up question? Because perhaps I misunderstood, but my understanding about the original SMA report was a concern about the fact that fewer children were able to actually read music in the way that we traditionally think about it, and concerns over the impact that that might have. So that, I suppose that's why I was coming at it thinking that that's how. Yeah,
that's interesting. I think there was a sense of that, definitely, Laudan, but then as an independent researcher, I was more interested in, well, I wanted to know whether people thought that there was a gap, but also all the questions that underpin that. So if you're saying there is a gap, what is the gap in? And, you know, and if you're going to be asked to research music literacy, my first question was, well, what do you mean by music literacy? So that opened up all these other channels, and I didn't come in from the perspective of this is what we should be doing. I'm sure there are people who do have that feeling very strongly, but I was trying to open it up to a broader conversation. Hopefully I've managed to do that. We'll see.
But if I could just come in there, I was somebody who, was a founder officer of the Society for Music Analysis back in 1991, which feels a heck of a long time ago. I suppose it is nearly 30 years. It's a very tricky one, is this, because I know that there is a sense that in order to practice some modes of analysis, for instance, Schenker, post-Schenkerian analysis, set theoretic, there needs to be a level of literacy within what is a Western music tradition, familiarity with harmony and counterpoint, in order to be able to get to the stage where it would make sense to actually employ those particular tools. So that is one stance, but that would be a very restricted view of what music analysis is, because music analysis involves narratology, psychological approaches, a whole raft of measures, and ethnomusicological inquiry can be analytical. So it would be, as I say, very sort of constricted. But it is a fact that I suppose that if one hasn't got familiarity with harmony and counterpoint, one can't then do those particular modes of analysis, which perhaps assume a greater proportion of what is deemed to be the discipline. That needs to be the case. There is certainly, surely, a lot more untapped scope.
Yeah, it's a fascinating debate, isn't it? It came up through our presentations, and I imagine we're also grappling with it in our own institutions. I know we are, as we plan the revalidation of our course at the RMCM. I think what I feel, and I think maybe others might feel too, is that whatever we call musical literacy, it needs to not be a barrier. So, and especially now, I imagine, all those amazing kids who make music at school, over the last 6 months, instead of having their violin lesson, maybe they've been playing on GarageBand. And, is what they've produced fascinating and important and valuable? Well, of course it is. So that idea that when musical literacy becomes a barrier to the next stage in somebody's progression in someone's musical career, I think that's when we need to stand back and think, is there something awry here? I know, for example, people who come through our own institutions might become incredible laptop coding performers, and they can use Max MSP and they can produce these incredible events. And yes, they might have come into the system because they could differentiate cadences, but do they need to be able to do that to pursue their career and their art and their discipline? Maybe not. So there's a lot for us to think about, I think, in terms of where that becomes a barrier.
Yeah,
sorry. I was just going to say it would be really interesting to get a sense nationally of how many music degrees you actually need musical literacy to get onto, to be able to manage the programme. So at City, absolutely, you cannot do the BMUS without musical literacy as we would traditionally understand it, being able to read 5-line staff notation. But many years ago, the very first teaching post I had was at an institution, the West London Institute of Higher Education, and Derek Scott was head of music there, and you did not need musical literacy traditionally defined to do a music degree. I don't know how many places there are now that that's the case. So it would be really interesting to have, I don't know if this has been included in Hilary's research or not, but are there any music degrees across the country? I know Freya Jarman, for example, has a music analysis course that she teaches to non-music majors without standard notation. But in most cases it is a barrier, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. From Liverpool and its music industry degrees. I mean, certainly in the past there have been various routes through, you know, where that would not have been an issue at all, and it just seems we have a very narrow conception if that's all that we rate, as it were. You know, that we're richest when we are at our most diverse and you know, make the most of the heterogeneity of music as a discipline.
Can I just say that obviously there are everything you said, I would say that I found out about in some form, but there is a question about the purpose of a music degree. What is it really trying to do? And different degrees have different purposes. There are different music degrees, as you said, and then there are debates around what those should be offering, and you know, whether they're just leading to a very particular narrow end, or are we trying to broaden things. But it also, I've been looking at the QAA information about, you know, what's meant to be in a music degree and all things from that perspective. So, you know, it's a very complicated one. And actually the point about GarageBand and all that kind of thing, I agree with you. And I think one of the issues that is coming out is that music analysis tends to, and this is where multiliteracy becomes more important, it tends to revolve around a very particular kind of analysis, and Schenker's been mentioned. But actually what seems to be missing is a really top quality analysis for people who are using technology to create music. It seems to be a bit of a gap. So I think there are gaps, probably, but then it depends on what you're trying to achieve. What are your goals? What's the purpose of your degree? Where are you trying to get students? I know one thing that came up was the idea that some of these things should now move up to master's level instead of degree level. A couple of people have mentioned that. You know, and that causes problems, because then people think, oh, you know, a degree isn't what it used to be, because now we're saying it's only postgrads. And I don't really subscribe personally. This is a personal view, but I've always thought that one should have the highest aspirations for everyone to do whatever they want in the best way that they can do that thing, whether it's GarageBand or it's something else, and not sort of restrict it. So yeah, I think there are lots of ways of doing it with that very high aspiration as your end point of let's all do the best that we can, and not try and, you know, bring things down because we're a bit worried that people might not be able to do it. Because my sense from the students is that they're very keen to learn, they want to learn more, they're really, really interested. And I think sometimes it's about how we facilitate that as educators right across the board.
I think one of the things we haven't yet sort of hit on centre stage is the notion of discipline, disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, post-disciplinarity. I mean, you know, what is music? Wow. We are in an age where music has been so enriched by its engagement with other humanities disciplines, by history. I mean, we mentioned the sort of a very good exemplar with the Royal Historical Society for the music education project. But I mean, the enrichment from aspects of history, from science, from culture, philosophy, politics. I mean, so our notion of what is music has expanded hugely across the last 30 years. The whole business of new musicology in the 90s, the kind of literary critical perspectives. And you can't hope, having expanded it and taken all the benefits from that, to sort of squeeze it into the same size box that you had before. And obviously not everything will fit, but does that matter? Because I mean, Hilary was just saying, what's it for? And that's a crucial question. What's a music degree for? It's not to equip everybody to go on and do the same job, because there aren't all those jobs that are identical. So it's got to be sufficiently niche, and for students to be able to tailor it towards their own interests, their experiences and their expertise, in order to kind of reap the benefits of that. Which does make the whole idea of QAA benchmarking, beyond the threshold level, whatever we mean by that, much more tricky, doesn't it? I mean, I rue the day that I sound terribly old-fashioned, lost the polytechnics. I think having a variety, rather than all universities being sort of the same, I love the fact we've got universities and conservatoires, but the polytechnics were fantastic at that hands-on vocational stuff, in a way that Germany would be very proud of, in terms of kind of technical skill and hands-on. So we don't want to reduce, to the sort of the minimum sort of common denominators. I mean, we want to celebrate that diversity and variety.
Absolutely. I wonder actually on that question of, we're all talking about the evolution and the expansion of a sense of what a music degree can be. It brings to mind, Michelle, something you spoke about, the videos that NAMI produced. What is the value of a music degree? So I wonder, could you remind us what the sort of general presentation of a music degree was in those videos, and how it might actually have evolved even in the short amount of time since then?
Yeah, so those videos were fantastic. Miguel Mawer put those together about a while ago now, 5 or 6 years maybe, but you know, they're still really, really useful. So there are 4 videos that focus on 4 professionals working in the music industry. One was Alison Balsam, and then there was a choir who worked doing a lot of widening participation work. There was someone who used her music degree in a professional context, not directly related to music. And the idea of those videos was so that they could demonstrate just how useful a music degree can be and the skills it can give you, and how broad those skills are. And I think that's something that NAMHE, now MusicHE, wants to do more of and needs to do more of. I think sometimes I find in our discipline we can sometimes be very good at talking about what that we feel that a music education is important, but I think sometimes we need to do more on the emphasis of why. So you know, why should someone study A-level music? And I think we all know that, but I think given the current climate and especially UK priorities in education, we need to focus much more on the application of music. And we all know the kind of rich skills that you can get from that. What Deborah was just saying there reminded me that one of the other debates that we've been having in our institution is this idea of whether the job of a music degree is to teach students facts, so to recognise a cadence, to know Beethoven's 9 symphonies, or to teach them to be critically inquiring and intellectual and curious, and to challenge ideas. And I think it's probably a bit of both. I think the second part of those sometimes gets too neglected, because music is, you know, it's so powerful. Everybody feels strongly about music, and it's an excellent tool to develop people's skills to challenge ideas, you know, all ideas in the world. So I think the ability of music to train exciting young minds in all sorts of ways can sometimes be really untapped.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Michelle. It's this advocacy of music, isn't it? I mean, what certainly used to be called transferable skills, as well as the kind of music-rich skills. You know, the fact that folks in music have had experience with teamwork, you know, which is crucial in most sort of industries, offices, with leadership, with kind of sharing, you know, the idea of ensembles and sharing ideas. I mean, those are all, you know, beyond the subject matter itself, the how of them as much or more than the what, you know, is crucially important. I thought, whilst we're trying to kind of keep a very positive steer on this, I mean, one of the things that we do have to acknowledge is the really disappointing decrease in the numbers of folks doing A-level music and GCSE, because, you know, we are very close to a point of crisis. I mean, I haven't got the exact figures, but in the last 5 years, it's something like a tailing off of 25%. And I mean, I've been looking at a study which was actually produced by Birmingham City University for the Academy and the College, which is about geographical and demographic trends in A-level. It was undertaken by Adam Whittaker and Martin Folkley in the School of Education. And I mean, you know, the conclusions are A-level music is a minority subject. There's a clear evidence of an issue with the future supply of young musicians becoming potential music graduates of suitably advanced standing if the downward trend continues. You know, so we are, whilst we can see hugely the value of music, our advocacy, you know, it seems as though we can't do enough to actually get this message across. And I think it's increasingly challenging now that the university, now that the exam boards are not, don't have a connection with universities as they did in the good old days of, you know, JMB and so on, and they are effectively independent businesses at some level. So to try and get that dialogue and you know, sort of degree of communication that perhaps we had more of in the past, though possibly universities weren't actually, you know, quite sufficiently interested in what was always going on in terms of feeder routes. So that's complicated the situation, and we do have a crisis, and we also have a crisis because of the EBAC problem, and again a recent report on that with Alison Dobney, Gary Spruce, and the ISM, on this notion of what's core and what's not core, and the fact that for a lot of small music departments, we have seen their demise. So there isn't anybody there to talk to anymore. And okay, we've got the music hubs, which is great, and we need a much bigger dialogue with them, because in many ways they are the new faces of what were those very small school music departments. This particular research that I was just talking about with Adam Whittaker has established that at least 30% of schools are working with only one full-time music teacher, and that's actually been another reason why our constituency within the RMA are wanting us to kind of provide opportunities for those music staff to talk to each other, to actually share ideas, because it can be a very lonely business. And the group size for A-level music is typically three students. So again, there's not a lot of chance for them to share ideas. So we really do have a role in trying to bring people together. So yeah, I don't want to put a big down on it, but just that business of A-level music, we, in many respects, we still rely on it. It's not everything. And I know that there are some university music departments who, are acknowledging that students coming in with history, with sociology and so on, have just as much to offer to a music degree. And so they're accepting some students without A-level music, and that makes a lot of sense, I think.
It would be interesting to know what's happening with BTEC numbers, because we have a fair number of students coming in with BTECs, and whether those numbers are going up as A-level numbers are going down or not. I don't have those statistics, but that would be, BTEC performing arts, for example.
They're going up for us.
They are, yeah.
Yeah, it's only one institution, but
I mean, are the numbers? They're going up for us in terms of the number of students coming in with them, but are numbers of students taking those exams nationally going up as the A-level numbers are coming down, I wonder?
That's a very good question. I don't have the data for that from this particular report, but it's typically a sort of scenario being painted of music being lost from the curriculum. So I suspect that there is also a reduction in the number of BTEC performing arts, but I don't know. I haven't got the data.
And also obviously tied into the provision of instrumental teaching for younger children and so on. And as that's being impacted by cuts of various kinds, that's bound to be having an impact as well. I don't have the data on that, but I get a sense that I don't know if anyone else has information on this, but what is happening to the provision of instrumental teaching for younger children? Do we know if the numbers of children learning instruments has also gone down in recent years?
It's a really good question, isn't it? I'm just going to sound a 5-minute warning, by the way. Time has absolutely flown, unfortunately, but we will have to stop in about 5 minutes. I'll bring Michelle in a moment, but just as Deborah was talking there, absolutely I acknowledge all those challenges, but it did remind me that Hilary, you did highlight some really good practice, certainly in secondary schools. I wonder, could you briefly talk to that, and then Michelle afterwards?
Yes, I don't think I gave any examples, but I do have some. Where it was done really, really well, which kind of ties in with pedagogical gender, which is the idea that somebody who has really, really deep knowledge of music is able to use a huge variety of music and to encompass all different interests, because they have that deep knowledge and they can use it very, very effectively. There is a place which is their academies where they're actually using the way they teach music to teach maths because they've had such success. And somebody else I spoke to, where 25% of the students in that school go on to do music. But this is what I'm saying, it's very, very patchy, that some places are brilliant and some places are problematic. The other problem that's coming through is that, looking slightly further ahead, there is going to be a slight problem with music teachers, because people are not coming through with this. So people are talking to me who are in music teacher education. They have things like, a day for primary school teachers who are training 1 day on music, which is never going to be enough. Then they're bringing in external organisations. So there are several of those. There's Triangle, which is working with a huge number of primary schools. There's Musical Futures, which is introduced in secondary schools. There are lots and lots of good initiatives. Just on the BTEC, the numbers for BTEC are not very good, actually. GCSE is still much more popular, possibly because of the, kind of kudos that GCSEs and A-levels have still in the world, in people's minds. So those are all interesting things to consider. There was one other thing I was going to say in relation to something that was coming up there about something. It'll come back to me in a minute. Too many things going on in my mind at once in terms of that. What was your original question there, Stephen? It might remind me.
I think you've covered it quite well. It was just thinking about good practice and good examples, yeah.
Oh, I know what it was going to say. Yes, there are very many good examples, but one of the interesting things about doing the research is that I've contacted every single hub, as I think I mentioned in my presentation, and I only got a response from one. And then I try another route. There are 122, I think, and I got one response. I also contacted every exam board, and I managed to speak to one person. I can't say what the exam thing was, but that seemed, and I also met people when I went to the expo, Music Expo, and I tried to encourage people, and they were very keen when I was talking to them, but I haven't managed to speak to anybody. And I don't think they've completed the survey by looking at the sort of backgrounds. So, that's a great disappointment. And I think, because you were saying there, Deborah, I feel like there's a disconnect between the exam system and people who are really interested in, I don't know who they are because I haven't managed to speak to them. And they probably are very interested, but I'm not quite sure what their thoughts are.
Thank you. Michelle, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just an anecdote I was going to share in relation to the previous conversation around the value of music. I was writing a book chapter last week, and I wanted to just have a quick search of anything that had been written online about the impact of COVID on music, live music performance. And I just Googled COVID and music, and what I actually found was not what I was expecting, and that was a huge wealth of research that's already been published on how music has helped people through the pandemic. And we know that research is going on. I'm sure we've all seen it from our colleagues, and it's excellent research, but there's a lot already been published. And I think that, for me, that was really remarkable, that when you search for COVID and music, what you find is how music has been absolutely essential to people's mental well-being, getting them through this crisis. And we need to shout about that. That we all know that there's no doubt about the value of music and the value of studying music, but it's things like that we need to be really aware of and really, keep reiterating, because I think most people would say that music's been a big part of how they've got through this very difficult time, and we've got the research to prove it.
Just on that note, through my letterbox yesterday, latest issue of British Journal of Music Education in a Time of Pandemic, the initial editorial. So it's there.
I can't believe it took us, I think, 37 minutes to mention the big C. So that was good going. We'll have to draw things to a close in a moment, but I wonder, could we just go around, if you have any final thoughts, whether it's on each other's work or perhaps something from your presentations. I'll just say really briefly that though clearly there's a huge range of challenges we're all facing and trying to deal with, I certainly found encouragement from each of your presentations, so thank you for that. So could we start with Deborah, and just a brief sort of 30 seconds final thoughts on anything you think appropriate?
Okay, well, I mean, coalescing some of the stuff I said and the really pertinent stuff that was in all of those talks, I think we should be as upbeat as we can. As Laudan said, we have the first female president of the Royal Musical Association, just coming to her post now, and the vice presidents. Youth, yes, the emphasis on youth, young people who do have a resilience. I think one of the things which I said towards the end of my short talk was it's never been more important that we work together, that we work sort of collectively cooperatively, that we share things and that we operate as a sort of whole joined up sector, and that we try and get dialogue going with the hubs. We've had a certain amount of success with some research at RBC. But we're so much better working together, and in times of challenge, it just makes so much sense. So I think that would be my parting shot.
Thank you, Deborah. Hilary, do you want to go next?
Oh, well, my final thoughts are that I'm really delighted that there's so much interest actually in preserving music education, because I agree with you that its value is far too important to lose. And I would like to see more sort of collaboration between different parts of the education system, because it does feel a little bit separated at the moment. And I don't know I don't know how that's going to happen, but hopefully there will be a way to do that, because it's been a situation it has been a problem for quite a long time. I think I mentioned the Laudan report, and there are some things that haven't really changed. And I would like to see going forwards some very, very positive moves for primary, and really to support people who want to keep music going. Thank you.
Michelle?
Yeah, mine ties in with what Deborah was saying, working together, absolutely. I think not only have these last 6 months showed us that we can do more, we can be more productive when we work together, we can make bigger steps. I think it's more enjoyable too. I mean, I think we've got a fantastic community in our music colleagues at all levels of education, and I think the more we work together, the more we can have an impact.
Thank you. Laudan?
Well, yes, just to echo what's already been said, and I think Michelle's right. I think particularly MusicHE has done a fantastic job in bringing colleagues from across the discipline together at this time of crisis. I sometimes, it is easy sometimes to feel that we're facing somewhat insurmountable challenges with the drop in A-level numbers, and now the impact of COVID on the profession, and the work that won't be there necessarily for our students to go on to. And I think it is really important to keep positive. And for me, yes, going back to I think what Deborah just said, the strength of our discipline is in our young scholars coming through, and we have some amazing young people, and that really does give hope for the future, I think.
Great. Well, really good to end on another note of hope. So thank you, everyone. I'll stop recording now, but thanks again to everyone for your presentations and your contributions to the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.